Imagine, if you will, picture a board, like a massive glass-walled room, very top of one of the most powerful entertainment conglomerates.
Oh, well, absolutely. The classic mahogany table, the leather chairs.
Right, exactly. And the executives sitting around that table are currently pouring over $10 million into a marketing, throwing money at it. They're coordinating across, multiple major corporations. We're talking development studios, massive game publishers, and global television.
Yeah, and they are hiring top-tier A-list voice talent, too. They're basically drafting this multi-year, totally synergistic blueprint designed from the ground up to engineer the absolute perfect billion-dollar entertainment franchise.
Right. They aren't just making a piece of media. They're trying to build a cultural juggernaut.
A total empire.
Exactly. So the hype machine is primed, the action figures are being manufactured, the television screens are ready, and then they finally push the big red button. They unleash this meticulously crafted titan onto the world, and the world responds with a collective, resounding,
Yeah, not anger, not outrage, just pure, unadulterated a multi-million-dollar shrug.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. If you're listening to this right now and you work in marketing or software development or really any creative field, this next hour is going to sound painful.
Oh, it's going to hurt.
It really is. We are unpacking the fascinating, bizarre, and almost entirely forgotten anatomy of a manufactured franchise. We're looking at an incredibly detailed YouTube video essay from the channel LS Mark, which breaks down the colossal failure of Nickelodeon's mid-2000s multimedia experiment Talk and the Power of Juju.
Which is just such a wild story, because this entire saga is a masterclass in how not to build a universe. Whether you are curious about high-level business strategy or the grueling inner workings of media production, or, you just want to understand why certain characters stick in our cultural zeitgeist while others just vanish without a single trace, this deep dive is going to be incredibly revealing.
Yeah, to really understand this failure, we have to establish the sheer scale of the hubris involved.
Sure.
We need to travel back to the mid-2000s. Nickelodeon was not just a successful cable network at this point. They were an absolute, undeniable monopoly on youth culture.
Oh, they were defining an entire generation's sense of humor, their imagination. I mean, you physically could not escape SpongeBob SquarePants.
You really couldn't. It was everywhere.
It was on merchandise in every store. It was quoted in every single schoolyard. And beyond that, you had Avatar, The Last Airbender, which was fundamentally redefining the narrative complexity that was even possible in Western children's animation.
Right.
And on the live action side, they were pumping out hit after hit that just dominated the ratings. They weren't just participating in the cultural conversation for anyone under the age of 18. They were dictating.
They were the undisputed kings of the playground. And here is where the psychology of corporate dominance gets really interesting, I think. Because they were so dominant, they became insulated, they got overconfident.
They absolutely did.
They looked at their organic, creator-driven hit shows that were born from, weird, quirky pitches by passionate artists, and they thought, well, we don't need to wait for the next great idea to walk through the door.
We don't need to rely on lightning in a bottle.
Exactly. They thought we can artificially manufacture our next billion-dollar mascot totally from scratch.
And it is the ultimate corporate trap. I mean, I see this all the time in tech and entertainment. When a company succeeds so wildly, the executives start to believe that their success isn't the result of unique creative genius or just cultural timing.
Right. They think it's a formula.
Yes, a foolproof mathematical formula that they own and control. They start to think they can just engineer magic on a spreadsheet.
Which brings us to the incredibly ambitious and deeply flawed blueprint that started. Because if we want to understand how a multi-million-dollar franchise falls flat on its face, we really have to look.
And the craziest part of this story is that this massive Nickelodeon property didn't even start at Nickelodeon.
No, it didn't start in a writer's room in Hollywood or a storyboard pitch meeting.
It started a decade earlier, way back in 1995, at a video game studio called Avalanche Software. Now, for some industry context, these are the developers who would eventually go on to create the massive Disney Infinity franchise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But back in the mid-90s, they were just a relatively small team with an idea. And I mean literally, an idea born from a dream.
Wait, a literal dream?
A literal, actual dream. One of the developers at Avalanche had a vivid dream where he was playing a video game that put him in control of a tribal witch doctor.
That is it's so random. Just a vivid dream about a witch doctor.
Exactly. And that simple, weird concept completely enamored the whole team. They started mocking up concept art, making internal pitches for a game that would eventually evolve into Talk and the Power of Juju. But we have to look at the landscape of the gaming industry at this time to understand why this pitch was so unique.
Right, because this was the era of the great 3D platformer boom.
Yeah, the market was being absolutely flooded with these massive titles trying to define the new generation of 3D 3D consoles. Every studio is out there trying to make their own version of Super Mario 64.
Right, you had games like Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper.
But if you look back at those specific games, they all shared a very particular focus-tested aesthetic. They were trying desperately to be cool for teenagers.
Oh, totally. They were slick, they were slightly edgy, they featured these shadowy, futuristic cyberpunk cities, heavy metallic weapons, and protagonists who were basically sarcastic anti-heroes with massive attitude problems.
Exactly. They were designed to feel like playable sci-fi action.
Right. But Avalanche decided to take this talk concept in the exact opposite direction. They looked at what was dominating television, specifically what Nickelodeon was doing with its animated blocks, and they decided to lean into being an interactive, immersive cartoon.
Yeah, talk wasn't about laser blasters and hoverboard. It was about tribal magic. It was about interacting with incredibly stupid, goofy animals.
And it heavily featured those exaggerated squash and stretch animation techniques that you usually only see in 2D hand-drawn shows. And of course, a very heavy dose of gross-out humor.
Oh, so much gross-out humor. And the protagonist himself, Talk. He was designed to be anything but a cool action hero. He had this massive distended belly and a giant bulbous nose.
Yeah, he was weird. He was physically ugly, and it was deliberately, unabashedly cartoonish.
And that deliberate ugliness, that embrace of the cartoon aesthetic, is exactly what caught the eye of the executives over at Nickelodeon. Because while the entire gaming industry was busy trying to prove how mature and edgy it was to an older demographic, Nickelodeon was making hundreds of millions of dollars doing the exact opposite for kids.
And they were actively prowling the market for properties that could be expanded into massive multimedia franchise. They wanted intellectual property that could fill up toy shelves, rake in box office numbers, and just dominate television blocks.
So how does a television network actually go about doing that with a video game?
Well, Nickelodeon had a specific business blueprint they were absolutely obsessed with, largely because they had just pulled it off with massive, unexpected success.
Oh, you're talking about Jimmy Neutron.
Yes. Jimmy Neutron, boy genius. That is the Rosetta Stone for understanding the Talk disaster.
It really is, because Jimmy Neutron didn't start as a traditional 2D animated show that was greenlit through the normal Nickelodeon pipeline, did it?
No, not at all. It started as a 3D tech demo created by John A. Davis, built entirely outside of Nickelodeon's usual infrastructure, just to showcase what off-the-shelf computer animation could do. Nickelodeon saw it, took a massive risk, and produced a feature-length theatrical film first. Right, the movie comes out, it's actually incredibly charming, it gets nominated for an Oscar, and it gives Nickelodeon this immediate built-in audience of millions who already love the world and the characters.
And then, because the assets were all digital, they could just reuse those movie-quality 3D models to spin it off into a hit television show, video games, and mountains of merchandise for a fraction of the cost of starting from scratch.
It's brilliant, really. All you had to do was heavily market the initial launch, and that launch marketed everything else for years to come. It was the franchise-first blueprint.
Exactly. And they wanted to repeat that exact same strategy with Talk. I mean, they tried this model a few times. They tried it later with Barnyard, creating a movie to launch a show. And then, somewhat disastrously, they tried it with Wonder Park.
Oh my gosh, Wonder Park.
Which is a whole other fascinating story involving a $100 million movie where they quite literally forgot to hire a credited director.
That is insane. Just forgot to direct.
But for Talk, the corporate structure they built to execute this blueprint was massive and incredibly convoluted.
It's staggering when you look at the flowchart. You have Avalanche Software, the independent studio with the original dream, actually doing the hard work of developing the game. Then you bring in THQ.
And THQ at this time was an absolute powerhouse publisher. They were making a mint publishing licensed games for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox.
Right. They knew exactly how to distribute Nickelodeon properties like Rugrats and SpongeBob to the mass, so THQ is publishing it. And then at the top of the pyramid, pulling all the strings, you have Nickelodeon directly partnering with them.
Yep. Nickelodeon essentially owns the IP right. They even slap a special custom Nick Games logo right at the unskippable opening of the game to claim ownership.
And because Nickelodeon feels like they own the future of this property, they take total charge of the marketing and the multimedia expansion. We're talking about historical reports suggesting a promotional budget of nearly $10 million.
I want to emphasize how unprecedented that was for an untested brand new IP in 2003. $10 million just to advertise a game that hadn't even proven it was actually fun to play yet.
Let me give you an analogy for what this franchise-first strategy actually feels like in practice. It is exactly like a massive real estate developer deciding to build a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar luxury shopping mall right in the middle of a barren desert, long before checking if a single person actually wants to live in that desert.
Oh, that's perfect.
You're laying down 10-lane highways, you're building massive department stores, you're hiring an army of security guards, and you don't even know if there's a community within 100 miles. It's putting the cart not just ahead of the horse, but miles ahead.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, and it illustrates the fatal danger of a top-down corporate mindset. When those Nickelodeon executives saw the success of Jimmy Neutron, they didn't see a unique creative endeavor born from a specific director's passion.
No, they saw a reproducible formula.
Exactly. They engineered this entire Talk franchise from the top down. They looked at the spreadsheet, they mapped out the corporate synergy, they planned the fast food toy tie-in, but they completely failed to realize a fundamental truth about media.
Which is that audiences do not connect with marketing blueprints.
They just don't. Kids are remarkably perceptive. Audiences connect with character. They connect with stories. They connect with emotional resonance.
Yeah, you cannot look a kid in the eye and say, you're going to love this swamp boy because we spent $10 million telling you to love him.
Right. If the core product lacks a soul, the entire multi-tiered corporate structure built on top of it will simply collapse under its own weight.
Which naturally brings us to the core product itself, because all the marketing, all the cross-promotion, all the boardroom synergy in the world, it doesn't matter a single bit if the actual thing you are selling is fundamentally broken.
Nope, not at all.
So what happened when the first game, Talk and the Power of Juju, finally hit the shelves in 2003? The reality of the game had to clash.
Well, the most interesting thing is that at first glance, it really wasn't broken. In fact, if you boot it up today, for its time, it looked genuinely impressive.
It really did. The graphical presentation was fantastic. Avalanche built these lush, vibrant, naturalistic jungle environments. And remember, they wanted to be an immersive cart, so they actively avoided those generic video gamey elements.
Yeah, if you played a Sonic game or a Crash Bandicoot game, you were constantly bouncing on giant metal springs or floating platforms that made no logical sense in the
Floating in the sky.
Right. But Avalanche wanted the world of Talk to feel organic. If you needed to get to a higher platform, you didn't look for a floating elevator. You had to find these massive sleeping orangutans that would pull down tree branches to physically fling you across the map.
I loved that mechanic. Or like, if there was a stone wall blocking your path, you didn't just throw a cartoon bomb at it. You had to figure out how to lure a wild rhino, mount it, and ride it to smash through the barrier.
Exactly. It featured genuinely impressive physics engines for the time and a real attempt to make the flora and fauna of the world feel alive and interconnected.
And Nickelodeon was keeping a very, very close eye on this production. They wanted to make absolutely sure that this multi-million-dollar investment appealed to their core demographic, which was primarily 7 to 12-year-old boys.
Oh, yes.
So they didn't just let the game developers write the story, they brought in their own television. They hired a TV writer named Randolph Hurd to write the game script, ensuring it had that familiar mid-tier Nickelodeon.
And what does mid-tier Nickelodeon flavor mean in 2003? It basically means an absolute avalanche of fart jokes, burp jokes, and gross-out humor.
Exactly. They also brought in heavy-hitting voice talent to legitimize it. They cast Jason Marsden as Talk. At the time, if you watched cartoons, his voice was ubiquitous. He was Max in a Goofy movie. He was Chester in The Fairly Odd Parents.
Yeah, it gave the character an immediate sense of auditory familiarity for a kid sitting in front of their TV.
And then they deployed the absolute secret weapon of the game. They cast the incredible Patrick Warburton.
Oh, Patrick Warburton is a legend.
He is. He played Look, this supposedly prophesied great warrior who almost immediately gets turned into a sheep by the evil shaman villain Trolloc.
And according to the source material, Warburton's legendary deadpan delivery ends up carrying the comedy of the entire game, even when his character spends a significant portion of the runtime suffering from explosive diarrhea caused by the poo-poo juju.
The poo-poo juju. I mean, it is incredibly lowbrow, without a doubt, but it achieved exactly what Nickelodeon set out to do. From a tonal perspective, it felt exactly like playing an episode of one of their morning cartoons.
But then, a kid actually sits down, picks up the controller, and starts playing. And this is where the cracks in that multi-million-dollar foundation start to show almost immediately.
Yeah, the game opens with this agonizingly long, completely unskippable cutscene.
Unskippable cutscenes are the worst.
The Village Shaman literally just stands in front of the camera, talking directly to the player, dumping mountains of dense lore and exposition on you before you're even allowed to take a step forward.
And it gets so much worse. Once you finally get control of Talk, you are immediately forced into a tutorial that treats you like you have never seen a video game console in your entire life. The game literally stops dead in its tracks, freezing the screen to explicitly teach you how to press the X button to jump.
It pauses the immersion just to deliver a mechanical lecture.
Exactly.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. I want to push back on the source's criticism of this a little bit. If you are Nickelodeon and you are dropping $10 million on marketing, isn't a hand-holding tutorial exactly what you...
How so?
Well, you cannot risk a 7-year-old renting the game from Blockbuster, not immediately understanding the controls, getting frustrated, and turning it off forever. From a pure business standpoint, making the game completely idiot-proof makes total sense, doesn't it?
I see that perspective, and it is exactly the argument that happens in Boardroom, but it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of game design. It is like the textbook example of corporate anxiety overriding creative vision. Think about the legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, who created Mario. His philosophy is the invisible tutorial. You design the first level so that the player naturally discovers how to jump by placing an obstacle that they simply cannot pass without trying different buttons. They learn by doing, which makes them feel smart.
Ah, so they feel ownership over their progress.
Precisely. By stopping the game to say press X to jump, Nickelodeon is demonstrating a complete lack of trust in their audience. They're so desperate for the product to be accessible to absolutely everyone that they inherently contradict the immersive, organic design that developers work so hard to build.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't spend 3 years building a world where you naturally discover how to use orangutans to travel and then pause the game to explicitly read a manual to the player.
Exactly. It smooths off all the edges until the experience becomes actively patronizing.
And the gameplay issues certainly didn't stop with the tutorial. The controls themselves were notoriously stiff. In a 3D platformer, fluid movement is your entire core loop. If jumping isn't fun, the game isn't fun.
Right.
But in Talk, the developers really struggled with momentum physics. If you committed to a double jump midair, your trajectory was locked. You had almost no room to adjust your momentum to land safe. It made the platforming feel incredibly tedious and punishing.
And to make matters worse, to artificially pad out the length of the game so it felt like a full $50 value. Halfway through the campaign, they introduced this massive backtracking fetch quest.
Oh, I hate those.
You are forced to revisit all the old levels you already beat just to collect 100 glowing magical orbs before you can progress to the finale. It's a blatant slog designed to waste the player's time.
Yet, despite the stiff control, unskippable exposition dump, the patronizing tutorials, and the agonizing fetch quest, the game was released and heavily buoyed by Nickelodeon's massive, inescapable marketing reach. We're talking relentless commercials during all their biggest primetime shows, full-page glossy ads in Nick magazine, cross-promotions on cereal boxes. The game actually performed. It sold an impressive 1 million...
A million units, and this was in 2003, going up against absolute titans of the industry. It launched in the same window as masterpieces like The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, and massive hits like The Simpsons. Hit and run. By all corporate metrics, selling 1 million copies of a weird new IP is a massive, unmitigated victory.
But the source points out a fascinating paradox here. That massive victory actually doomed them.
Yeah, it really did.
Because when you are operating under a franchise-first mandate, 1 million units sold doesn't mean the executives say, "Great job, team. Take your time, figure out what worked and what didn't, and craft a thoughtful follow-up."
Not at all. It means the executives say, "We have a hit. We need a sequel on the shelves before the financial quarter ends next year." The success triggered an absolute mandate for a rushed, heavily compromised follow-up.
And that leads us perfectly into the downward trajectory of the franchise. Because the very next year, literally less than 12 months later, they pushed out Talk to the staff of Dream.
The year is 2004, and we have to deeply unpack the pressure the developers at Avalanche were under, because it wasn't just a tight deadline. The entire gaming industry was undergoing a massive, painful paradigm shift.
Right.
The transition from the 6th console generation, the PS2 and GameCube, to the 7th console generation, the Xbox 360 and PS3, was beginning to loom over every studio.
This was the jump to high definition, right?
Exactly. And the jump to HD meant that the costs of game development were suddenly violently skyrocketing. Polygon counts for character models were tripling. Environments needed high-resolution tech. Teams that used to be 20 people suddenly needed to be 80 people just to build the art assets.
That's a huge leap.
Huge. Games were becoming exponentially more complex and expensive to make, and players' expectations for graphical fidelity were rising just as fast. The days of a small, scrappy team pumping out a quality 3D platformer from scratch in under a year were officially over.
So, faced with an impossible 12-month deadline mandated by Nickelodeon and mounting developmental costs, Avalanche had to make massive compromise. They completely scaled back the ambition of the world.
They had?
The sprawling, naturalistic, open-world exploration of the first game, the whole organic jungle feel, was largely ditched. Talk 2 became a much more narrow, linear, straightforward run from point A to point B experience.
Now, ironically, because the game was forced to be more linear, it actually accidentally improved that stiff platforming we talked about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, by condensing the experience and removing the need for sprawling exploration, the developers could tightly script the jump. The moment-to-moment gameplay actually felt faster and a bit more refined simply because the scope was so drastically reduced.
Well, the gameplay might have been slightly tighter, but the story, the grand narrative that is supposedly building this massive multimedia universe, it was a complete unmitigated.
It really was.
It is incredibly obvious that the writers didn't have the time to figure out what they were doing or why. The plot was a convoluted mess of talk, randomly jumping in and out of a magical dream world to save a princess we've never heard of. They heavily relied on Patrick Warburton's line delivery to just carry the entire script, sheer comedic force, hoping players wouldn't notice the plot.
And then they commit the ultimate sin of storytelling. After slogging through this rushed narrative, the game has the sheer audacity to end on the universally despised "it was all a dream" trope. Talk wakes up and none of it mattered.
So
It is the absolute clearest indicator of a rushed development cycle. When a writing team doesn't have the time to organically untangle the narrative mess they've created and write a satisfying conclusion, they just hit the reset button and go to the credit.
But the most visceral indicator of this rush happens during the gameplay itself. If you play Talk 2, you can pinpoint the exact moment right around the halfway mark of the game where the studio simply ran out of money and time. It is jarring. The tightly designed linear levels suddenly disappear, and the game reverts back to these repetitive, empty, open-world areas. The cutscenes, which used to be fully animated with lip syncing, suddenly become completely less.
It's awful. Character models just stand there stiffly locked in T-poses while the dialogue plays. The audio mixing takes a massive nosedive, with music cutting out entirely. It's like watching a car run out of gas while speeding down the highway.
That's exactly what it feels like. It's the digital equivalent of seeing the duct tape holding the set together.
And yet, because the momentum of the Nickelodeon marketing machine was still pushing forward at full speed, Talk 2 still managed to sell around 1 million units. But the critical cracks were widening rapidly. The franchise was no longer surviving on its own merits. It was surviving purely on brand recognition and marketing inertia.
So what does a corporation do when quality drops but sales remain steady? They push for a third game.
Of course they do.
2005 brings us Talk, the Great Juju Challenge. And this is where the scaling back becomes truly. They completely abandon the action-adventure narrative entirely. Talk 3 isn't an epic quest. It is just a co-op, tag team arcade. You and a friend run through enclosed obstacle courses for points. There is barely any story at all.
And the visual representation of this creative decline is so stark, it's almost poetic. The entire premise of Talk 3 is that you are competing in a massive, globally anticipated grand tournament. But when you finally beat the game, when you win this ultimate challenge, a cutscene plays showing your victory, and the massive stadium stands surrounding you are literally empty.
Wait, really? Just empty?
Completely empty. There are no character models in the seat. There's no one there to cheer for you. The game itself visually acknowledges its own lack of budget and scope.
Wow. It's the perfect, tragic analogy for the franchise at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, think about those empty stands at the end of Talk. That is exactly what was happening to the property in the real world.
Yep.
The audience, the cultural momentum, everyone had just sort of packed up and left the party, but the main character was still down on the field, performing the routine, completely alone.
It's a haunting image for any creative endeavor. But the fatal blow to the franchise didn't actually happen on a television screen or in a game console. It happened in a corporate boardroom. During the development of that third game, the massive conglomerate, Disney, swept in and bought Avalanche Software outright.
Just bought the whole studio.
Swallowed them whole. This was very common in the mid-2000s. Massive media empires absorbing mid-tier independent developers to bring development in-house. Suddenly, the original development team, the people who actually dreamed this witch doctor concept up in 1995, the people who actually cared about the IP were completely gone.
All right.
They were absorbed into the Disney machine, specifically tasked with making tie-in games for movies like Chicken Little and Toy Story 3.
Okay, so the creators are bought by a rival company. Nickelodeon still owns the IP rights to the character, but the people who invented the character are gone. What does this mean for the future of Talk?
It means the absolute loss of the torchbearer. If we connect this to the broader reality of how successful media works, losing the original visionary team, someone like Avalanche CEO John Blackburn, who championed this idea for years, is a death knell for any property.
Because there's no passion left.
Exactly. When a franchise loses its creator, it ceases to be a passion project. It becomes nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet, an orphaned asset passed between completely disconnected corporate divisions. It loses its soul.
Which sets up an incredible, almost tragic irony. The game studio is gone. Creators are. The third game was a critical flop. This means that the entire survival of this multi-million-dollar, carefully engineered franchise now rested entirely on one single...
The TV show.
Yeah. Nickelodeon had to get the television show out. According to their $10 million blueprint, The games were just the appetite. The TV show was the main course. If the show failed, the whole empire collapsed. But as we are about to see, they were marching straight into a production nightmare of their own making.
Because the TV show, the crown jewel of their multimedia strategy, was deeply, perhaps hopelessly, trapped in development hell.
Oh, it was a spectacular disaster. So the original plan, according to their meticulously crafted corporate synergy blueprint, was for the TV show to premiere in 2004, right alongside the second Maximum Cross promo. But the show didn't actually air until 2007.
3 years late, 2 full years after the last main talk game had already been released and forgotten by the public. The synergy they spent millions planning for was completely dead on arrival. But why the massive delay? It comes down to a clash between technical infrastructure and sheer hubris.
Exactly. Nickelodeon looked at the massive success of the Jimmy Neutron show, and they wanted that same 3D computer-generated magic for talk. But here's the massive catch that the executives overlooked. Nickelodeon didn't actually animate Jimmy Neutron themselves.
Right, they outsourced it.
Yes, they had outsourced it entirely to an external studio called O Entertainment. Nickelodeon's internal studios in Burbank were legendary, but they were built from the ground up for traditional 2D hand-drawn shows like SpongeBob or The Fairly Odd Parents. They had absolutely no 3D CG animation pipeline set up in-house.
And we need to explain why that's such a massive hurdle. You can't just tell a team of 2D animators to start doing 3D.
Right. Trying to force a 2D animation studio to suddenly render 3D CG is like asking a master oil painter to suddenly sculpt a statue out of marble.
Oh, great analogy.
Thanks. I mean, yes, they're both broadly categorized as art, but the physical tools, the physics of the medium, and the entire methodology are fundamentally entirely different. In 2D, you draw a frame. In 3D, you have to build digital skeletons, rig the movement physics, map the lighting engines, and establish server farms just to render the shadow.
Beautiful analogy. But for talk, because Nickelodeon owned the IP so completely, they stubbornly insisted on keeping production in-house to maximize profit. So they spent years just trying to build the physical and digital infrastructure to make a 3D show. And while the executives were struggling with server racks and rendering software, they were completely neglecting the creative side of the show.
There was no real showrunner assigned. There was no creative visionary steering the ship or protecting the lore of the world.
The casting alone is a perfect example of this utter chaos. They go back to Jason Marsden, who would voice talk in all 3 games, and they tell him, hey, we finally got the rendering software working. We're doing the show. We need you to come in and re-audition for the role.
Wait, they wanted him to re-audition?
Yes. And Marsden, rightly insulted by this, basically says, why on earth would I audition for a role I've already been playing successfully for 3 years? He refused to play their game, so they just recast the main character.
That is wild. It highlights a complete structural disconnect between the video game production division and the television production division. They weren't building a unified universe. They were just 2 separate corporate departments managing competing assets.
And the resulting show. Oh, man, if you go back and look at it now, it is a visually appalling, boring disaster.
Truly, all those lush, naturalistic jungle environments that Avalanche built in the first game, gone entirely.
Yeah.
Because rendering complex foliage in 3D takes massive server power that Nick didn't have, the jungle was replaced with these incredibly flat, plasticky-looking backgrounds set against dark, empty voids.
And the character models were horrific. They had these giant, weirdly modeled, blocky hands and feet.
And there's a technical reason for that.
Yeah. Giant hands and feet are easier to animate in early 3D because you don't have to worry as much about the models clipping through objects when they grab them.
Yeah.
But the aesthetic result is hideous. The source material specifically compares the visual look of the talk show to Planet Sheen. And if you know animation history, Planet Sheen is notoriously considered one of the ugliest, most visually washed out, and universally disliked spin-offs in Nickelodeon's entire history. When your flagship $10 million franchise looks like Planet Sheen, you have lost the visual battle before the first episode even airs.
But the tragedy wasn't just the visuals. They fundamentally misunderstood what talk was. They took this property that, in the games, was at least attempting to be an epic action-adventure story about saving a tribe from dark magic, and they completely stripped the act.
They turned it into the most generic, paint-by-numbers domestic sitcom imaginable.
Because without a creative torchbearer to fight for the story, what do the exhausted writers do? They default to the path. They default to the same tired, recycled sitcom tropes they use for every other show on the network.
Yeah, it is mind-numbing. You have an episode where Talk has to magically disguise himself as a girl just to enter a no boys allowed club.
So unoriginal.
You have an episode where he accidentally ruins a gift for a friend and spends 20 minutes of screen time trying to hide it. These aren't stories about tribal magic, ancient prophecies, or juju power. These are recycled scripts from The Fairly Odd Parents with a cheap jungle coat of paint slapped on.
Right. The characters were just manufacturing their own conflict out of sheer stupidity because the writers had no idea what to do with a jungle setting.
And to make it worse for anyone who actually did play the game, the showrunners didn't even care about the continuity they had spent 3 games building.
Oh, this part drove me crazy.
They reintroduced the main villain from the games, Treylock, and for some bizarre reason, they rename him Treylock, but they introduce him to characters who had already fought and defeated him in the video games.
They just act like they don't know him.
The characters interact with him as if they've never met him before in their lives. It completely invalidates the games that the fans had supposedly invested their time and money in.
I have to bring up the theme song, too, because I think the theme song is the perfect distillation of how much effort a studio is putting into a show. Think about the iconic animated theme songs of that era. Danny Phantom, Jimmy Neutron, SpongeBob. Those songs are legendary.
Masterpiece.
In exactly 30 seconds, they perfectly explain the entire premise, establish the tone, and build the world of the show. You know exactly what you're about to watch.
They are masterful pieces of catchy exposition and branding.
But the Talk theme song. It is just a grating, repetitive, electronic chant of people yelling "Talk, Talk" and the Power of Juju over and over again. It gives the viewer absolutely zero information about the world, the powers, or the state. It is devoid of any world building whatsoever. It genuinely sounds like they just recorded the title of a show on a loop, layered a drum beat over it, and went to lunch.
This raises an incredibly important question, though, a question that gets to the heart of corporate media. How does a massive network like Nickelodeon, the absolute reigning king of children's television, fumble their own medium so catastrophically?
That's exactly what I want to know. Think about how hard it is to fail at what you are literally the best in the world at doing. How do they mess this up so badly?
I think it goes back to the difference between organic creation and corporate engineering. The Talk television show didn't exist because a writer or an animator had a burning, passionate story they desperately needed to share with the world.
No, it existed to sell things.
The show existed solely because a corporate spreadsheet drafted in 2001 dictated that there must be a television show by Q3 of 2007 to drive fourth quarter merchandise sale. It was a contractual obligation, a chore, not a creative endeavor. And audiences, even young kids, can instinctively feel when something is hollow. They know when they are watching a commercial disguised as art.
So you have a show that looks awful, actively ignores its own lore, relies on tired sitcom tropes, and features a grating theme song. Unsurprisingly, it starts bombing in the ratings immediately. But remember, Nickelodeon has millions of dollars and years of corporate strategy invested. They cannot just let it quietly die without a fight. They have to force kids to care. Which brings us to their final desperate trick.
Forced synergy. When the core product fails to attract an audience organically, the corporate reflex is always to artificially inject into products that are already successful. It's a blatant attempt to borrow credibility.
Exactly. And to prop up this failing TV show, Nickelodeon decided to forcibly insert the character of Talk into their highly lucrative Nicktoons crossover video game. We are talking about massive holiday release games like Attack of the Toybots, Globs of Doom.
These crossover games were a huge deal for kids at the time. They were essentially the Avengers of cable television. You have the absolute titans of the era teaming up. SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron, Timmy Turner, Danny Phantom.
These were iconic, beloved characters with years of deep cultural impact and massively successful, long-running shows behind them.
And right in the middle of them, Nickelodeon plops Talk. This shirtless kid with a bulbous nose from a couple of OK PS2 games and a failing sitcom.
They literally shoved his face onto the front cover of the box art. In one of the games, they actually bumped Timmy Turner, one of their most popular characters in network history, off the cover entirely just to make room for Talk. It was an entirely unearned core.
It's a fascinating marketing tactic, the whole fake it till you make it approach on a corporate level, but it almost always backfires because it breeds resentment.
To put it in perspective, it's like a major record label taking a beloved, legendary boy band that has been touring together for years and suddenly forcing some untalented, unknown industry plant into the group for their new album.
That's exactly it.
The label is pointing at the new guy and saying, look, he's standing next to Justin Timberlake, so he must be a star. But kids aren't. Their media literacy is so much sharper than executives give them credit. They know when they're being told what they look at Talk standing next to SpongeBob, and they know intrinsically that he does not there.
And that forced inclusion couldn't save the franchise. The final nail in the coffin came in 2008 with one last desperate, agonizing video game tie-in. Talk and the Guardians of Gross.
Oh, this game. This is where it all ends. It was developed by a completely different studio, Blitz Games, who were primarily known at the time for churning out low-quality shovelware. Those cheap games your grandmother buys you out of the bargain bin at the grocery store.
Yeah, and this game was tied directly to the continuity of the terrible TV show, not the original Avalanche. And it was a technical nightmare. You were fighting these giant garbage monsters with incredibly stupid, uninspired names like Trash Thulu and Slap Viathan.
And the gameplay was heavily plagued by terrible, screen-obscuring bloom lighting. Wait, for those listening who aren't huge gamers, what exactly is bloom lighting and why was it so bad?
Bloom is a graphical effect used to reproduce the imaging artifacts of real-world cameras, basically making bright lights bleed over their edges. In the mid-2000s, developers discovered that if you crank the bloom effect all the way up, it smears the light across the screen, which conveniently hides cheap, low-resolution textures.
Ah, so it's a shortcut to hide bad graphics.
Exactly. It's like smearing Vaseline on a camera. But in Guardians of Gross, it was so overused that players could barely see what they were doing. Combine that with painfully long, game-breaking loading screens, and it was clear this was a product pushed out the door with zero quality control, purely to fulfill a corporate synergy mandate.
And the tragic punchline to this entire saga. Just 3 months after that awful game was released to abysmal review, the Talk TV show aired its 26th and final episode. Nothing, no big announcement, no press release, no grand finale. The franchise was just quietly, unceremoniously killed behind closed doors with zero fanfare. The 6-year, $10 million experiment was over.
Which brings us to the autopsy. This is the core takeaway, the absolute crux of why we are diving into this obscure piece of media history. Why did Talk fail so completely?
Because, like the source pointed out, it wasn't a scandalous disaster. The creators didn't do anything illegal. It wasn't mocked into oblivion by the culture. It didn't ruin the network financially. It just vanished.
Why? Because of a profound, fatal identity crisis. What's fascinating here is that Talk never actually figured out what it was trying to be.
Right.
Look at the truly successful mascots of that era. Crash Bandicoot was clearly defined by chaotic, Looney Tunes style slap. SpongeBob SquarePants is so distinct, so confident in its weirdness, that you can identify the show's exact tone from a single out-of-context frame of animation. They have undeniable, rock-solid identity.
But Talk, was it an action-adventure epic about saving a village? Was it a gross-out comedy about poop juju? Was it a domestic sitcom about boys' clubs? Was it a mystical journey?
Nobody knew.
It tried to be every single one of those things across different mediums to appeal to every possible demographic, and as a result, it succeeded at none of them.
I think you're hitting on the core issue. The games leaned towards adventure with a bit of comedy. The show stripped out the adventure entirely and leaned into cheap sitcom tropes. The crossover games tried to pretend he was already a legendary icon. It was a franchise constantly shifting its shape, driven by panic, trying to figure out which version of itself would finally stick to the wall and make money.
Talk was a franchise that was built first and defined second. They had the massive spreadsheet, they had the $10 million marketing budget, they had the corporate synergy flowchart, but they never stopped to ask the most important question in art.
Who is this character and why should anyone actually care?
Exactly. And in a crowded market, especially the entertainment market, being just fine or A is a death sentence. It is the fastest, most efficient way to become entirely invisible.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how media work, it proves that you simply cannot reverse engineer passion. You can coordinate multiple massive corporations. You can buy the most expensive shelf space at the toy store. You can run commercials 24 hours a day. But if you don't have a singular creative voice, a torchbearer fighting tooth and nail for the soul and identity of the project, audiences will see right through the plastic exterior.
And that, for you listening right now, is why this strange little piece of history mattered. We just took a massive journey. We went from a developer's vivid dream in 1995 through millions of dollars of corporate marketing, a string of rushed and compromised video games crushed by the weight of changing technology, a visually appalling and creatively bankrupt television show, and a desperate, embarrassing attempt at corporate cross-promotion, all ending in total, deafening irrelevance.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale for anyone trying to build something big.
We live in an era currently defined by cinematic universes, endless spin-offs, and multimedia empire. Every major corporation right now is trying to build the next endless content. Tax stands as historical proof that you cannot engineer cultural relevance. You cannot manufacture nostalgia in a boardroom. All the money in the world without a beating heart at the center of the art will only ever result in a collective shrug from the audience.
It leaves us with a critical lens to view our current landscape. When we look at modern media today, whether it's the latest massive live service video game that took 8 years to build but no one wants to play, or a sprawling cinematic universe that announces a slate of 10 interconnected movies before the first one even filmed, or even the rollout of a massive new tech platform. How often are we seeing the exact talk strategy playing out right in front of us? Are we currently consuming things that were designed solely for a corporate spreadsheet rather than designed for an audience's genuine connection?
That is a brilliant point. The technology changes, but the corporate hubris stays exact.
And more importantly, it makes you wonder about the very nature of cultural impact. If a multi-million-dollar, meticulously engineered franchise falls in the woods and nobody cares, did it ever really exist at all?
Think about that the next time you see a massive $1 million billboard for a cinematic universe you've never heard. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep learning, keep questioning the media you consume, and you next.